Hello there, and welcome to the first of 6 briefings in the Parkinson's Foundation's 9th Expert Briefing Series. Our topic for today is going to be nutrition and Parkinson's disease. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Dr. James Beck. I'm the host for our discussion today. And before we begin, I just want to take care of some housekeeping items. And first, I want to point out that these webinars were not created by a bunch of pointy-headed PhDs like myself, but these expert briefings are created for the PD community by the PD community. The topics for our expert briefings are suggested through our annual survey of the PD community, and we collate those in collaboration with our colleagues in the regional organizations, Parkinson's organizations, to bring these together into our series we have here today. So I certainly would like to make a shout out to our collaborators who are our partners, and they're members of the Alliance of Independent Regional Parkinson's Organizations, or AIRPO. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge the important role our sponsors play for these series, AbbVie, Synovian, and Lundbeck. Without their generous support, these webinars would not be possible, so I'd like to say thank you to them. For those of you who haven't are looking now at the screen, you can download the PowerPoint slide deck on the viewing page that you're looking at right now. If you look at the bottom left for the download slides link, you can download a PDF file at any time during this webinar. And so for those of you who've joined us previously and are familiar with our history, you may see a new format for our slides. We are now the Parkinson's Foundation. We've merged with the National Parkinson's Foundation in Miami and the Parkinson's Disease Foundation here in New York. And so we've in the process of changing our logo and format. And so this is our interim slide, and we hope to have some new colors to share with our next webinar that we're going to have later on this fall. I'd also like to acknowledge that many people in our community are experiencing floods or fires or hurricanes, and so I hope that they're doing well. And for those of them who cannot join us today, we'll be certain to archive this for future listening. Health professionals who are joining us can earn 1 free CEU through the American Society on Aging. If you registered as a health professional and indicated you'd like CEU, you'll receive an email by the end of today with the steps on how to collect that CEU. Just remember, you have 30 days, though, until October 12th to collect that free CEU, so I encourage you to do so. And now it's my pleasure to welcome our guest speaker for today, Dr. John Duda. Dr. Duda is the Associate Professor of Neurology at the University of Pennsylvania at the Center of Excellence for the Parkinson's Foundation. He's Director of the Parkinson's Disease Research, Education, and Clinical Center, PADREC, at the Corporal Michael Crescent VA Medical Center in Philadelphia. Dr. Duda research focuses on understanding the role of alpha-synuclein in Parkinson's disease, and he's authored numerous scientific papers, which have been in the likes of JAMA, Science, Neuron, and New England Journal of Medicine. And so he currently serves on the editorial board of Movement Disorders. Dr. Duda received his medical degree from Thomas Jefferson University and Bachelor of Science in Psychology from Penn State. He completed residency in neurology at Hahnemann University Hospital in Philadelphia and followed up with a fellowship in neuropathology of neurodegenerative diseases at the University of Pennsylvania. So it's a great honor to have him here today to speak on the topic of nutrition. So Dr. Duda, welcome.
Thank you, Jim, for that kind introduction. It's really my pleasure to be with you guys, and I understand that there are over 1,100 people registered for this conference, so I'm flattered with the attention that this topic is getting. It always does seem to be very high on the minds of patients and caregivers, and for good reason, I think. I wanted to start out with a brief disclosure statement that I have no personal financial conflicts of interest from this talk. I don't take any money from pharmaceutical industries or food industries, for that matter. I declined the compensation for this presentation. I do receive research grant support from the Department of Veterans Affairs, the National Institutes of Health, Michael J. Fox Foundation, and the Department of Defense. And frankly, I am personally biased by my own anecdotal experience in how healthy lifestyle can impact your well-being for both myself and my patients. I've been running a brain wellness clinic at my center for over a year now and talking about nutrition and exercise and other wellness modifications, and have really been impressed in how just taking control of your own well-being by starting to eat right and exercise and getting the proper sleep leads to an empowerment that is really powerful in your experience of Parkinson's disease. There are three objectives for this talk. The first one is understanding how dietary choices can affect symptom control in Parkinson's disease. The second objective is to discuss how the gut microbiome may be involved in Parkinson's disease. And lastly, we're going to talk about the possibility that sound nutritional choices may provide disease-modifying effects in Parkinson's disease. So to get started right off, I would just want to say that I am going to focus, obviously, since most of you are patients or caregivers, on practical points that you can use in your own lives to modify your lifestyle choices in ways that I think will likely help your Parkinson's symptoms and modify the way that the disease affects your life. One question that I always get is, how does diet interfere with Parkinson's disease medications? And many of you are probably aware that levodopa, one of the components of Cinemet, is a large neutral amino acid. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins, and levodopa is like one of those, and it gets absorbed into the guts, into the brain with the same mechanisms that these other amino acids do. So that some people with Parkinson's disease will notice that if they take their Cinemet at the same time that they're taking a lot of protein that has these other amino acids, it might have a loss of efficacy if they do that. So generally, we recommend that people take carbohydrate dense meals in the morning and lunchtime, and save a lot of their. I'm sorry, that's the next point. Generally, we recommend that people take their Cinemet 30 minutes before or 60 minutes after their meals to minimize the amount of interference from the amino acids in the protein in their meal. If that doesn't work, then we recommend other dietary modifications, which I'll talk about in a second. The other thing that a lot of people don't know is that iron can interfere with the absorption of carbidopa, levodopa, so that iron supplements or multivitamins with iron should not be taken within 2 hours of taking Cinemet. As I mentioned, some people, even if they take their Cinemet half an hour before a meal or after, will still have problems with absorption. And it is possible that those problems can lead to motor fluctuations, which are variability in the way that a patient experiences their symptoms. And that may improve by a change in the diet pattern. And several people have studied this. Slide's not changing. Oh, sorry. A meta-analysis in 2010 included 16 studies of people who have studied different dietary patterns. And they looked at low-protein diets and what are called protein redistribution diets. And protein redistribution diets are ones in which most of the protein that you take during the day is taken at the last meal, at the dinner time meal, so that the interference that you see from the amino acids and the Cinemet is minimized during the bulk of the day. This meta-analysis suggested that there was no support for a low-protein diet in Parkinson's disease, but about two-thirds of the studies reported about an 80% response rate for protein redistribution, meaning that 80% of people did notice some benefit in motor fluctuations when changing to a protein redistribution diet. Several of the studies looked at what were the characteristics of people who did benefit from such a strategy, and the take-home message is that the patients who started the protein redistribution diet earlier in the course of the disease with less severity of their motor fluctuations were more likely to get a benefit. So those of you who have some motor fluctuations where either you simply wear off, your symptoms get worse before you take your next dose, or you have more complex motor fluctuations with, at times, not getting any benefit from a dose or having rapid changes, might benefit from trying a protein redistribution diet. Now I'm going to go through a couple symptoms that have clear strategies with nutritional modifications that might be helpful for you. One of them is sleepiness, which is highly prevalent in Parkinson's disease. A lot of people with PD are sleepy during the day. And not surprisingly, caffeine can help with sleepiness. This has been studied in a couple studies by Ron Postuma and his colleagues, and they found that the equivalent of 2 to 4 cups of coffee a day clearly improved daytime sleepiness. There's a second trial called Cafe PD, which hasn't been published yet to my knowledge, but confirmed a significant benefit. As you can see in the figure on the left half of the figure, the black line is the Epworth Sleepiness Scale, which is a measurement of how sleepy someone is during the day. And you can see that the red line of the people who took the caffeine clearly had more of a decline in those symptoms, so a clear benefit. Orthostatic hypotension is another symptom that is fairly common in Parkinson's disease, occurring in up to 50% of people over the course of the illness. It's defined as a drop in blood pressure upon standing. So what patients will typically notice is that when they go from lying to sitting or sitting to standing, they'll feel a little lightheaded, as if they're going to faint. The disease itself can cause this, and the medications can cause it as well. So it can be tricky to manage. In general, we start with behavioral modifications, including dietary ones, avoiding large meals, because when you take a lot of food at one time, a lot of blood is diverted to the digestive system, stealing it away from other parts of your body. Increasing a dietary salt intake, and I highlighted increase because it's one of the few times we'll recommend increasing dietary salt. Increasing fluid obviously can help maintain the volume in your blood vessels, and decreasing alcohol. How much water should you drink? Well, there's a little debate and not a lot of evidence to support it, but around 1.5 to 2 quarts a day, the old adage being eight cups a day, or 8-ounce glasses, or 64 ounces is a rough rule. Some people probably don't need that much, and some people may need more than that. In general, I tell people to drink enough so that their urine is not clear. If your urine is clear all the time, you're probably drinking too much, but not dark either. It should be just a light yellow color. There are some assistive devices that can help maintaining your fluid intakes, some of which I pictured here from a company called Hydrate that I've been using with my patients with some success, that have just lines on the bottle that tell you, you should be drinking this much by this time during the day. And I have patients who have found this helpful. Malnourishment and weight loss is another problem that occurs commonly in Parkinson's disease. One reason may be that most people with PD, in fact, almost all people with PD, lose some of their sense of smell, and in reality, taste is mostly driven by smell. So people often feel that their food tastes bland, and their appetite will be decreased because of that. Some people will have significant weight loss, and in that case, I certainly recommend consultation with a nutritionist. But for others who just have a mild amount of weight loss, I think one dietary strategy is increasing the amount of herbs, spices, and other foods, other flavors in the food that can help to make the food more palatable to increase consumption. Constipation is obviously another very common symptom in Parkinson's disease, something that your doctor really should be talking with you about, because it's so common and distressing for most patients. In fact, some people suggest that we should think of constipation as the 5th vital sign. We should be talking about bowel movements every time you come to the doctor. I think that may be excessive, but certainly if you're having less than one bowel movement a day, it's worth talking to your physician about. The real definition of constipation is less than 3 or so bowel movements a week, but in reality, most people should be having about 1 a day, and if you're not, it suggests that there may be issues with your diet. The Bristol stool chart on the right defines the different types of stools, and a healthy diet will have stools like type 3 and type 4 in general, whereas constipated stools are often type 1 and type 2. To manage constipation with dietary changes, we always talk about increasing fluid intake, including coffee. Obviously, some people drink coffee in the morning to stimulate their bowel function. But then, at least as important, is increasing the dietary fiber intake from fruits, vegetables, beans, whole grains, nuts, and seeds. The whole grain fiber and other sources of fiber cause a bulk effect in the stool so that the stool will retain water and will move through the bowels better, decreasing constipation and decreasing the hardness of the stools. How much fiber should you eat? Well, ideally, if you eat a whole foods plant-based diet, you won't have to worry about it because you'll be getting more than you need. But for people who are not doing that, one general rule of thumb is that you should aim for 30 to 40 grams of fiber per day. And it's been estimated about 93% of Americans don't get that much. So instead of worrying about how much protein you're taking in, most people should probably worry about how much fiber you're getting. The way to assess it from foods that have nutrition labels is to look at the dietary fiber content. As you can see on the right, I've circled dietary fiber. It comes under total carbohydrates. A dietary source that has more than 5 or more grams of fiber in one serving is an excellent source. This hypothetical food on the right has 3 grams, so it's a good source, but not great. But then maybe even a better rule is to take the total carbohydrates, which in this case is 27, and divide that by the dietary fiber. And that number you'd like to see around 5 or less. In this case, it's 9, so it's a little high. So there's too much added sugar in this product, but it's better than some, worse than others. In general, obviously, I prefer that you ate foods that didn't have a nutritional label. All of the fresh foods, vegetables, fruits, nuts, seeds, whole grains, they don't typically come with a nutrition label, and those are the ones we want to focus on primarily. Obviously, one of the scariest things for people with Parkinson's disease is the possible risk of dementia or cognitive impairment, and I think it is very well established that diet can affect your risk of becoming demented. This is in all people, not just in Parkinson's disease. So these are just citations for 3 meta-analyses that all agreed that a Mediterranean diet, which is obviously a plant-based diet that can have some fish, low amounts of dairy and meat products, some amount of alcohol, high in olive oil and things like that, can clearly decrease your risk of getting dementia. The last symptom I want to talk about is bone health. Obviously, people with Parkinson's disease later in the course of the illness are prone to fall, and there's some reason to believe that that concomitant osteoporosis can make their bones more likely to break in that situation. So we want to pay attention to that. And for whatever reason, it's not really clear, but people with Parkinson's disease are more likely to have low vitamin D levels. And everyone with Parkinson's disease should have their vitamin D level checked, and frankly, most of them don't. So that's something you can take to your own physician and talk to them about. But the overwhelming majority of people I check with Parkinson's disease have low and often very low levels of vitamin D, to the point where it's very difficult to reach adequate levels by dietary intake alone from supplemented foods or from sun exposures. So that most patients should end up taking supplements and should aim for a 25-hydroxy vitamin D level, which is kind of how we measure vitamin D, in the 40 to 60 nanogram per milliliter level to promote bone and vitamin D has also been thought to be more of a hormone and involved in mental function as well. So it may decrease your risk of getting depression and dementia as well. So an important thing to keep in mind when you're talking to your doctor about nutrition. The second objective, as I mentioned, is a discussion of the gut microbiome in Parkinson's disease. And I want to start out by saying I certainly am no expert in microbiome analysis. We are conducting a study here at the Philadelphia VA Medical Center, but I have colleagues who are specialized in understanding how the gut microbiome plays a role in health and disease. And it really is one of the big stories in medicine of the last couple of years, and I think will continue to be for years to come. And in Parkinson's disease, it's got a lot of attention recently. Hopefully that doesn't keep going off, sorry. It is the 10 there are 10 times as many bacteria, yeast, and viruses and other organisms living in your gut and on your skin as every cell in your body. So it is an important part of who you are, and it's essential for your health. Without the gut microbiome, you won't be absorbing a lot of compounds that they're making. Some compounds that the bacteria in your gut are making and being absorbed are in quantities well over what we're taking for medical purposes for other compounds. So they pretty clearly play a role in health and disease, and understanding how much of a role that is in Parkinson's disease is a pretty hot topic right now. There's the reference that I cited on the bottom there from MPGA Parkinson's disease. There's a review article that's free access to everybody that discusses this topic. I'm just going to discuss a few studies that have been done and try to give you a bird's eye picture of what I think the take-home message is. This was one study from 72 patients with Parkinson's disease and 72 controls. And so you take a stool sample and you just do an analysis and try to find out what bacteria are in the stool. And interestingly, in this study, patients with Parkinson's disease had a 77% reduction in the abundance of a bacterial genus called Prevotella compared to control stool samples. Prevotella is a bit confusing because it has been some species of Prevotella have been implicated in infections and dental caries and things like that, but other species have been thought to be health-promoting and anti-inflammatory because of the production of something called short-chain fatty acids, which are compounds that the bacteria make from the fiber that you eat that gets absorbed by the lining of your gut and not only feeds those cells, but also probably has changes throughout your body. So that's one of the mechanisms why we think that bacteria in your gut may play a role in your health and wellness. The second study also showed a decrease in Prevotella, but it wasn't statistically significant in colonic biopsies. They actually took a piece of the tissue from your colon, but similar to the previous study, did show that some other short-chain fatty acid-producing bacteria were significantly more abundant in controls in Parkinson's disease patients, so that the short-chain fatty acid deficiency was consistent across both of these studies. There were also some other bacteria that were thought to be pro-inflammatory, which were significantly more abundant in the mucosa of Parkinson's disease than controls. Inflammation, obviously, is one of the things that we think is involved in the pathophysiology of Parkinson's disease. So anything that we can do to decrease our resting inflammatory state may in fact be helpful. There's a third study that came out more recently that essentially confirmed the high loss of Prevotella species, as you can see with the red box in the bottom right, in the Parkinson's disease stool samples compared to control people aged at the same age. So another study that showed that this big genus of bacteria seems to be underrepresented. And in the same study, they showed that the short-chain fatty acids were also decreased in the stools of Parkinson's disease patients, and acetate, propionate, and butyrate were the three that were decreased in those stool samples in this study. So the take-home message is that there seem to be large classes of bacteria that are underrepresented in the stool of people with Parkinson's disease, and those bacteria in general produce short-chain fatty acids, which we think are helpful for maintaining gut health, that are also underrepresented in Parkinson's disease stool. Now, how does that relate to what you're eating? Well, in general, this is a little controversial, I must say. There are people that have drawn some concerns about this body of research, but previously in 2011, a group of researchers looked at the stool from a fairly large group of people and found that in general, if you look at all the different bacteria in the gut of people, there are 3 different types of microbiomes in people that are commonly seen. And one of the main distinguishing factors between those types of microbiomes is the prevalence of Prevotella. As you can see in the middle of the figure, the enterotype 2 has a large abundance of Prevotella species compared to the other 2 common enterotypes. And Bacteroides on the left is more highly expressed in the other 2 enterotypes. What is interesting about that is that your long-term diet patterns seem to be strongly associated with the enterotype or the microbiome signature that you have in your stool. This study looked at 100 healthy people and basically determined that people can be divided into 2 general categories: people who have lots of Prevotella and low Bacteroides, and people who have lots of Bacteroides and low Prevotella. And the dietary patterns correlated well with those patterns, so that people who eat a lot of protein and animal fat have the high Bacteroides, low Prevotella, and people who consume a lot of carbohydrates and not so much protein and animal fat have the other enterotype, so that people eating mostly plant foods that have carbohydrates and not animal foods that have animal protein and fat have the higher abundance of Prevotella. Another study looked at people looked at Italians, 153 of them, who labeled themselves as vegan, vegetarian, and omnivores. And obviously, you can be an unhealthy vegan. If you're eating French fries and Wonder Bread and white rice and Twinkies, you're vegan, but that's not necessarily a health-promoting diet. So instead of going by what their self-reported dietary pattern was, they looked at their actual food consumption and looked at how well they match the Mediterranean diet by giving each one a score. They found that the majority of vegans and vegetarians did have high Mediterranean diet scores, but also 30% of the omnivores, the people who said that they eat meat and fish, had high diet scores too, suggesting they probably ate less of those meat products and dairy products and more fruits and veggies and things like that. What they found when they looked at their microbiome was that the people who had high Mediterranean diet scores had higher levels of Prevotella species and higher levels of short-chain fatty acids, as you can see on the bottom, compared to people with lower Mediterranean diet scores, supporting the notion that what you eat has an effect on the bacteria in your gut and how that leads to short-chain fatty acid production. So finally, I want to talk about how sound nutritional choices may provide a disease-modifying effect in Parkinson's disease, and then conclude with a short discussion of what I tell my patients based on what I know about nutrition. Disease-modifying effects are clearly the holy grail of Parkinson's disease research. It's a poor example of what the holy grail may have looked like, perhaps, but it really is one of the main targets of research. We've been looking for one for 20 years now, and even James Parkinson, 200 years ago this year, suggested that there appears to be a sufficient reason for hoping that some remedial process may ere long be discovered by which at least the progress of the disease may be stopped. Unfortunately, James Parkinson was a better clinician than a prognosticator, because it's been 200 years and we still don't have anything that clearly slows the progression of Parkinson's disease, although we've tried many things and there are still many ongoing trials. So hopefully we can say the same thing, that before long we'll have something, but at this time we really don't. That being said, we know a lot more about Parkinson's disease and what causes it than we did 20 years ago, and certainly 200 years ago. This is a wonderful review article from Verna Powie that came out recently this year. I'm pretty sure is also freely available online. And it just kind of reviews Parkinson's disease, not just the pathophysiology or what we think causes it, but everything else. So if you can get it, I recommend it. This is one figure from that paper that tries to summarize the major concepts that we think are involved in Parkinson's disease pathophysiology. And obviously, this talk, I don't have the time to go into these topics in general, but I just want to point out that the major topics or areas of research interest are included in this figure, including the role of alpha-synuclein, how it aggregates into fibrillar forms, and then macroscopically detectable forms like Lewy bodies and Lewy neurites. Another concept is oxidative stress that we've been focusing on for quite some time. We think it's involved in Parkinson's disease, and that's why we always talk about antioxidants and how they may help scavenge free radicals and protect neurons from the disease process. Mitochondrial function is another topic that we think is important in Parkinson's disease pathophysiology. It's related to oxidative stress because a lot of the free radicals generated in the cell are formed in the mitochondria, which are the power systems of the cell. And people with Parkinson's disease have been found to have dysfunction in mitochondria. As I mentioned before, inflammation is another component of what we think is important in Parkinson's disease pathophysiology, with inflammatory cells in the brain perpetuating neuroinflammation and leading to neuronal dysfunction and possibly demise. So what can nutrition or our dietary choices do to change any of this? Well, the possibilities are really highlighted by the recognition that in every plant food you take, especially whole plant foods, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of chemicals called phytochemicals or green chemicals that are only produced in plants that have wide-reaching chemical functions and likely in combination may work in an anti-inflammatory and antioxidant capacity to change many of the processes going on in the brain and in other chronic disease states as well. And people have been researching different phytochemicals in different aspects of Parkinson's disease in cell cultures and in animal models and things like that, and have shown that there is enormous potential for these phytochemicals to affect or reverse some of the changes that we believe are involved in Parkinson's disease. And I don't have time to go over all of these, but the flavonoids and phytochemicals have been shown to affect every component that we talked about and more. If you're interested in more detailed description of this, my colleague Sheetal Shah and I wrote a medical hypotheses review about it a couple of years ago, and so I suggest you take a look at that. But there are other resources on the web to learn more about those things as well. And obviously, just like the medications, none of these things have been proven to modify the disease progression or change the course of the illness. But the difference between some medications and these recommendations are that the downsides are completely different. Taking whole food, plant-based therapies for Parkinson's disease has wide-reaching side effects that include things that we mentioned decreased risk of dementia, decreased risk of depression, less constipation, all kinds of side effects that are probably beneficial. Not to mention all of the other chronic disease conditions that have been shown to benefit from that type of dietary choice, either a Mediterranean diet or a whole foods plant-based diet. So to conclude, just a couple slides on what I tell my own patients to do. Obviously, you're not my patients for the most part, so please talk with your own physician who knows your own medical history and medications and things like that before you make any big changes to your lifestyle. But in general, these are some simple nutritional recommendations that I think I'm comfortable making to everybody, given the low risk of problems. So, as I said, I believe the Parkinson's disease might be treated by increasing the level of antioxidants and anti-inflammatory compounds in your blood and brain. And the best way to do that is to eat more of the sources of these compounds, which are plants and all the different parts of the plant. So, fruits, vegetables, mushrooms, nuts, seeds, beans, legumes, whole grains, teas, spices. Increase your consumption of all of these things, in ideally an unprocessed, as unprocessed as possible. So eating the whole foods as much as possible, where some of the phytonutrients have not been taken out. And any kind of boxed or canned food has processing that affects these phytonutrients, and probably it's entirely possible to believe decreases their potential benefits. So sticking to the produce aisles in the grocery store and staying away from the center aisles is a good idea. And obviously, there is no magic bullet. We don't have any one particular food source that we think is clearly going to slow down the disease progression. But we know that certainly for other diseases like heart disease and stroke and cancer, that a variety is important. And all of these phytonutrients probably play synergistic roles. So the more you have, the more that you eat, they may work together. So have a lot of different variety. Don't just eat broccoli and brown rice every day. Eat different plant foods every day. In general, people don't eat enough nuts and seeds. It's one of the clear things that people have found looking at large populations and disease risk. So eat more nuts and seeds, whichever ones you like. Walnuts are great, but just about any nut and seed is good. And one recommendation that I make for most people is to eat 1 to 2 tablespoons of ground flax seeds a day. They're inexpensive, nutritionally dense with lignans and fiber and omega-3 fatty acids in the form of ALA. So a really good dietary change. And they don't taste like much, so you can ground them up and put them on anything. You do have to grind them up because they go through the digestive system unchanged if you don't. But that's one specific recommendation I have. Obviously, I don't want you to live twice as long with Parkinson's disease and be miserable the whole time. So eat what you need to eat to be happy, but try to eat it as a treat. Don't eat it as every time you eat. And eat more of the food that's probably good for your health the rest of the time. If you have to have a cheeseburger every once in a while, then to be happy, then have a cheeseburger every once in a while. Like I said, none of this is clearly proven. It's highly possible, and I do believe that it probably will change your disease experience, but it's not conclusive, and it's not at the stage where we should say that there's some specific changes you should make. The problem with some people is that they think they have to do everything all at once. Dr. Duda told me to become a vegan, and I can't do it. Well, don't try to do that all at once. Just try to give up some things that you know are unhealthy and include some more things that that we are pretty sure are healthy, and make those small changes over time become larger ones. If you're interested, unfortunately, it just came out yesterday, so I didn't include it in this slide set, but there's a new article that just came out in the journal Oxidative Medicine and Cellular Longevity regarding a large observational study conducted by Dr. Laurie Mishley at the Pasteur University, where they've looked at over 1,000 people with Parkinson's disease and looked at what they've eaten and have a novel patient-reported outcome of their symptoms. And this paper, which was just published 2 days ago, suggests that if you want to slow down, or the foods that are associated with a slower rate of progression include fresh vegetables, fresh fruit, nuts, seeds, non-fried fish, olive oil, wine, coconut oil, fresh herbs and spices, and foods that are associated with a more rapid progression. And this, remember, this doesn't necessarily mean causing, but it's associated with it, include canned fruits and vegetables, diet and non-diet soda, fried foods, beef, and dairy products. So more support for the idea that a Mediterranean or a whole foods plant-based diet may be beneficial. And what about organics? I'm sure people are going to ask me that question, so I'm just going to address it now. It's not clear that eating organics would clearly affect PD, just like everything else I'm talking about, but it is plausible. So in that case, I think there is a source of information that is reliable called the Environmental Working Group, where they analyze pesticide residues on different foods and come up with what's called the Clean 15, or 15 foods that are low in pesticide residue, even if they're not organic, and the Dirty Dozen, foods that, if they're not organic, will have lots of pesticides on them. So you can look up those. But actually, they rank 48 different foods from worst to best, with the lowest numbers indicating more pesticides. And so I've included that whole list for you here. And so, again, the foods in the top 10 are the Dirty Dozen, or top 12 would be the Dirty Dozen. So strawberries, spinach, nectarines, those things either often have lots of pesticides, or when you eat the food, you take them in. On the other side, foods like sweet corn may be using pesticide, but obviously you don't eat the husk, so you may be not getting them. And things like avocados and pineapples, you obviously don't eat the skin as well. So a whole list of pesticide food, burden in different foods. If you do decide to go to a whole foods plant-based diet, there are some things to keep in mind. Obviously, if you dramatically change how much fiber is in your diet, your microbiome has to catch up. So you will experience some GI discomfort or flatulence in many cases. You will have a change in bowel movements, which is often less constipation. There are some concerns to discuss with your primary care doctor regarding interactions with leafy greens and grapefruit and some medications. But then don't forget, obviously, to tell your doctor about your diet choice, because often people can cure hypertension and diabetes and decrease the risk of heart disease, in fact, reverse heart disease. So other medications may have to be adjusted as well. Finally, I don't know everything. These are just my opinions. In fact, most of what I think I know, I probably really just believe, and I think that's true for all of us. So educate yourself about health and wellness. Here are some books that I think are useful. Obviously, you can write anything in a book, so you have to take everything in a book with a grain of salt. But here's some books that I've looked at and I think are good sources of reliable information. And then also these are websites that I think are good sources of information and recipes for whole food plant-based diets. Nutritionfacts.org is my favorite, and I highly recommend you guys look at that website and the book from Dr. Michael Greger, who runs that website, called How Not to Die. Thank you. And at this time, I'll invite Jim back to start the question and answer session.
Thanks very much, Dr. Duda. That was a fantastic presentation. We actually, a number of folks have written in to say what a great job you've done. They really appreciate the hands-on practical tips that you're giving, and they're really useful for both professionals and the caregiver. Have also commented how it can help with helping a person with Parkinson's disease. So thank you very much. It's been a great opportunity to hear your thoughts on this. So a couple questions have come through, needless to say, and I think you did address one of them, which was the issue about organics, and I think that's really great. And one of the things that I think you may know the answer, but people have come through with a couple of these questions, as well as care partners and some professionals. What about supplements? I mean, we are in a society where GNC is on every corner. People take vitamins. I mean, you are, I think, advocating something a bit different than that. But how would you explain it to to this audience?
What I tell my patients, supplements are like dietary choices. There's none that have really clearly been proven to to help Parkinson's disease symptoms. I mean, I think obviously I mentioned vitamin D supplementation for people who are low. I think that's very important. And if you really are going to be eating a completely plant-based diet, then vitamin B12 is a critical supplement to be taking. But all the other ones, in general, obviously I have some concerns with them. The research that we've done to date hasn't proven to me that any of them are clearly beneficial. There's some reason to believe that vitamin E may help Parkinson's disease, but there's also reasonable data suggesting that people who take vitamin D, don't live as long. So, in general, I don't recommend that my patients take anything other than vitamin D if they need it, and vitamin B12 if they need it. I think coenzyme Q10 is an interesting one. Obviously it was disappointing that the trials didn't work out. The problem obviously is that these supplements are not regulated, so you don't really know what you're getting a lot of the time. And there have been instances in the past when a lot of people took a given supplement and there were found to be imperfections in the manufacturing process, and people got sick from that. So I cautiously recommend that people stay away, educate themselves well and think twice about supplements. They're not the magic bullet in most cases that sometimes they get made out to be. And, I'd prefer that people take, all the money they're spending on supplements and spend it on good, healthy, plant-based foods. And,
well, to follow up on that, I mean, one of the things that we think about is supplements are often pills or something like that you might get out of a bottle, but just beyond supplements could be things like, people, care partner in Michigan's asking about a ketogenic diet, like adding coconut oil. And then there's, the flip side of that. Nurse in Pennsylvania is concerned that, the Mediterranean diet's heavy in olive oil, so these oils. And that might be not such a good thing for heart health. How do you rationalize that? What are your thoughts on the heart issue, but also these kind of plant-based supplements or additives, but not something like you can pick up in a bottle, but something that you might be able to pick up at the grocery store in the food aisle.
Right. So I forget who said it first, but I'm kind of an advocate of the philosophy of the separation of church and plate. I don't think that there's any reason to think that any one particular food item is completely good or completely bad. And I eat a whole food plant-based diet, but at times I'll eat some sardines or something, and I don't beat myself up over it. I think for these in general these particular foods like coconut oil, there are a lot of really striking claims made about coconut oil, and for me it's hard to sort it all out. I mean, I think the medium chain triglycerides concept is interesting, but they are saturated, and so if you really look at the data, I think for your overall health, it's not really supported that you should be eating a lot of coconut oil. But everything I think has to be compared to something else. Like I said, there's nothing that's completely good or bad. So coconut oil has to be compared to butter. So I think it's better than butter, but it's probably worse than certainly whole food sources of fat like avocados and nuts and seeds and things like that. How it compares to extra virgin olive oil is, it's probably similar in my mind. I mean, I think obviously depending on what you use different oils for, you can have different risks with smoking points coming into play when you're cooking with oils and things. I think extra virgin olive oil, like I said, it's better than some things and probably not as good as others. I tell my patients that in general, if you're using oils, then extra virgin olive oil is probably a decent choice. It has a fairly high phytonutrient or flavonoid content. But if you're making a salad and you want some some fat in it to help you absorb the fat-soluble phytonutrients, then making your own dressings with nuts or seeds is probably an even better idea.
Okay, so I think you're really talking about having a broad diet and not just loading up on one particular thing.
Yeah.
About moderation.
I don't believe there's any silver bullets out there, and I think variety is an important concept. I'm not really an advocate of everything in moderation. I think there are certain things that are just not necessarily health promoting. Which is not to say that if you need to have something to be happy, well then have that thing to be happy. But I think everything in moderation is a bit of a cop-out.
Okay, so I guess everything in moderation, including moderation. So it's the way to go. Okay, so one of the things, as you're well aware, people with Parkinson's disease, especially as their disease progresses, weight can be a big issue, and you addressed it somewhat. But just wanted to drill down a little bit more on that. An easy way to gain weight is, especially because we think about things that make people happy, can be sweets. And what are your thoughts about? Because we have one person asking about this, and another allied health professional in Georgia who's concerned about this balance of the balanced diet. How do we find something that promotes weight gain, yet still is not going to provide increased cardiovascular risk?
Mm-hmm.
Is it carbs? I mean, do we say start eating bagels? But that can also counter the problem with constipation. So, I'd like to hear your thoughts.
So, weight loss is a tricky problem on a plant-based whole food diet. I mean, in general, even people eating a really healthy whole foods plant-based diet, it's difficult to be overweight. So, if you have a condition that in some people seems to be hypermetabolic or a propensity to lose weight, it can be tricky. What I tell people is that healthy sources of fat are a good choice. Obviously, avocados and nuts and seeds are very calorically dense and are a good source of calories. I think it depends on the situation. Sometimes people with Parkinson's disease who are kind of in the late stages of the disease will have a real problem with maintaining their weight. But in that scenario, I'm not so much worried about heart disease and things like that. So if it's late in the disease course and the weight is dropping, then like I said before, obviously nutritional consultation is imperative. But sure, give them what they'll eat and to maintain their weight. If you can mix in some healthy food as much as possible, of course. But for someone on the other side, someone who is kind of early in the disease course, typically younger patients who have trouble maintaining their weight, that's a little trickier because then you are obviously worried about heart disease and cancer and diabetes and hypertension. So in those cases, I guess I would lean more towards the healthy sources of fat and high calorically dense foods rather than the highly processed and sweets and things like that.
Okay, so we've got more questions, but I just wanted to just interject real quick just to remind our audience that we have an online survey, which is on your screen, and it's the feedback from you, our PD community, that really is there to help enhance and improve our webinars so that we are able to get the information that you want and that you need. So I also want to take this moment to thank our sponsors again, AbbVie, Synovian, and Lundbeck. Without their support, we wouldn't be able to have this series in its 9th year, coming up on 10th. We're not quite as old as the iPhone, which is 10 today, I guess, but we're working on it. So, you mentioned a lot of these issues, with weight gain and trying to get balanced nutrition. And you actually, I think earlier in your talk, mentioned, if it's a real issue, a person should go consult a nutritionist. How do you find a nutritionist, and is that covered by insurance?
So those are good questions. Without being overly political, I'll say that I work within the VA healthcare system, which is integrated. So I just put in a referral to a nutritionist and don't have to worry about finding one, and I don't have to worry about getting it paid for either. I guess at this point, and I apologize for most of the time when I give these talks, I start out by thanking the veterans who are in attendance. So all of the veterans who are listening in or their spouses, I just want to thank you for your service and make sure you're aware that Parkinson's disease is a service-connected condition for many veterans. So if you have Parkinson's disease and served in the military, you should definitely look into whether or not you might be eligible for benefits from the Department of Veteran Affairs. Outside of the VA, obviously your Parkinson's disease physician or neurologist obviously or ideally has nutritionists that he has worked with and can refer you to. If not that, then I guess I would refer my patients to people like you guys or support groups that might be able to help identify nutritionists who are well-versed in caring for people with Parkinson's disease.
Okay. And for our listeners out there, I just want to remind you that if you don't get your question in, we have our helpline available. And to answer these types of issues for nutritionists, our helpline is 1-800-4PD-INFO. That's 1-800-4PD-INFO. So, Dr. Duda, one of the things I hear when we talk about nutrition and foods is the healthy living that comes with it. But a lot of people want to try to extend that to other areas. For instance, fava beans can be a natural source of dopamine, and this is slightly off topic, but it's one that I thought would be interesting. Natural sources of dopamine, is it worth the bother? I mean, or you're better off, best served, trying to just stick with the medication and this whole food, plant-based diet to just keep your engine running.
Right. Well, there was, as I'm sure you're aware, a recent article that kind of compared the effects of mucuna pruriens to levodopa. That's one source of natural levodopa, and at least in a small, unblinded, I think it was unblinded, perhaps it was blinded, no, it has to be unblinded, study, they showed that the motor benefits were similar and there were less side effects taking the mucuna. So I think it is an area that deserves more investigation. I don't usually recommend it for my own patients. I mean, I have some patients who are trying it, and I tell them that I think it's a reasonable thing to try. As long as you're not highly processing a plant food, most of them are safe for you in modest quantities. So I'm not aware of any real risks, but as I understand it, it's not a trivial thing to kind of get a preparation like that. There are obviously commercial preparations derived from natural sources, but again, they're like the supplements. You don't really know what you're getting some of the time, and they haven't really been studied for the most part as much as FDA-approved medications. But that being said, I don't just try to dissuade my patients from trying out natural sources of levodopa.
Okay. So I recognize we're at the top of our hour, and I'm hoping I can keep you for a few minutes more because we've got a couple more questions I'd like to ask. And great. And so the first one is, and this is something I think we see a lot in society, and that's about gluten. Is there any relationship between gluten and Parkinson's disease? Is it something that should be avoided? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that is a common question. I think my understanding of the field is that there obviously are a certain percentage, 1% of the population or whatever, who have true celiac disease, in which case minimizing gluten is probably a good thing. However, gluten is one form of protein that's found in mostly whole grains that in general are good for you. So I think for the vast majority of people who don't have celiac disease, trying to avoid all gluten products is mostly a fad experience that may or may not be placebo effect. The speculation that large percentages of the population are what they call gluten intolerant and not celiac disease, I I just don't. I haven't seen the data that has convinced me that that's the case. There are obviously people who, if you have, GI symptoms and skin problems and other things, then, an elimination diet that includes eliminating gluten and slowly adding things back in is a reasonable choice for people. But I think that anybody who says that people with Parkinson's disease should unequivocally avoid all gluten, I'm not convinced that the data supports that conclusion.
Okay, thank you. Another question that comes up is for people who, have doctors who may not be as experienced with prescribing some of the PD medications, is there's a concern about interaction with foods. And so one of the questions I have from a person with Parkinson's in Texas is that some of the foods on your list that you're recommending are on the do not eat list because of tyramine for the MAO inhibitors, the class. Meanwhile, there's MAO-B inhibitors which people with PD take, like Azilect or Versagiline and Selegiline, Deprenyl. So what are your thoughts on that, and what would you advise a person to do?
So obviously, like I said at the beginning, I don't want anybody listening to me to take my advice without consulting their own physician. I think clearly, if you're on non-specific MAO compounds, then avoiding high tyramine foods is essential to avoid the potential hypertension. I think there's much less of a concern for people taking ribostigmine. I think the risk of the hypertension from a tyramine reaction is exceedingly low in that case. But a lot of the highest tyramine-containing foods like processed meats and aged cheeses, I'm not really recommending you eat anyway. But certainly, if you have any concerns about your medications and potential food interactions, then obviously that deserves a conversation with your own physician before making any significant changes.
Okay. That's really good advice. Thank you. Now, we've got time for one more question, and I just wanted to, ask this again, somewhat topical because of our discussion about the microbiome and things. What are your thoughts about fecal transplants for people with Parkinson's disease?
Yeah, and I guess let me throw in at the same time probiotics because
yes, please do. Yeah, because they are intermixed.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So it is an interesting concept. So let's start with probiotics. There's one study at least that suggests some possible benefit for people with Parkinson's disease taking a probiotic supplement. Most probiotics have a combination of lactobacillus and bifidobacterium and some other things that are not really the compounds that we're talking about that may be health promoting by producing short-chain fatty acids and things like that. So to my knowledge, there are no probiotics that have those compounds, and since many of them are anaerobic, it would probably be difficult to get into a supplement anyway. So that brings up the other possibility: instead of taking in those bacteria orally, then taking them in rectally with a stool transplant. In my mind, the stool transplants are really, they've been proven effective in conditions that have a wildly florid overgrowth of a particular bacteria. So you want to introduce other bacteria to compete with that bacteria and wipe out its proliferation. If you are thinking about a chronic neurodegenerative disease or even a chronic condition like heart disease or something, then in my mind, if you do a stool transplant, it doesn't matter what bacteria you put in there unless you feed them what they eat. The bacteria that eat fiber and unprocessed carbohydrate components are potentially the good bacteria, and if you don't feed them those sources of fiber, they're not going to proliferate, and the bad bacteria are going to proliferate anyway. So I think it's a little premature to say whether or not there is a clear difference in either the the bacteria that you got from your mother at birth, or other things that may actually be remediable with a stool transplant. But in my mind, eating healthy sources of soluble and insoluble fiber that will feed the good bacteria in your gut is probably at least as good an idea as considering something like probiotics or a stool transplant, because all you need is a good, healthy source of fiber, and people have shown in studies that within 2 weeks you can change the content of your microbiome by changing your diet. So if you're not willing to change to a healthy, whole foods, plant-based diet loaded with fiber to feed those bacteria, I think a stool transplant is unlikely to be very beneficial.
Yeah, it sounds like it's planting a new lawn but unwilling to water it.
Yeah.
Nothing's going to happen. So, John, Dr. Duda, this has been a fantastic presentation. The kudos keep flowing in. Excellent information, excellent presentation. Registered dietitian's on the call with her brother with PD, and she thanks you very much for this. And also have another dietitian on the call, and they had recommended for those who were interested in trying to find a dietitian that there's the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and they have a website called eatright.org, find an expert. So if you kind of Google eatright.org, you should be able to find perhaps a dietitian that way. John, thank you very much for excellent presentation and your time today, and I'd like to thank everyone else for listening in. And just to let people know that we have our next webinar on the docket coming up on Tuesday, November 21st, same time, 1 p.m. to 2 p.m., and it's about depression and Parkinson's disease treatment options with Dr. Roseanne Dawkins from Rutgers, my home state in New Jersey.
Thank you, Jim. I wanted to applaud everybody who attended and recognize their interest in learning more about Parkinson's disease as an important component of fighting back, just like all the other lifestyle choices that we can make.
Absolutely. On that note, we say goodbye. Thank you very much.